Okay, so this is the FlutterKids debugging process for whenever you run into an error, how to actually go about trying to solve it. So the first part is how do you spot an error? And there are two different ways that these can come about. One is you just get a red squiggly line in your code, or it happens in the debug console at the bottom of your screen. So if it's in your code, that means that there is something wrong with your code, whether that's a syntax error or some other error. And then the debug console, these same errors can pop up in your debug console. But if there's an error that's only in your debug console, that might mean that something happened with running your app. Like there might be an error with running your app, or an error with executing a function in your app. Um, so the first step is to read your error. And I know from experience that a lot of kids don't understand how to do this. They'll be like, oh no, an error. And I'll say, did you look at the error? And they'll say, nope. But the first thing you got to do is actually read what your error says. And the way you do this is just by hovering over it. And it's going to be confusing at first, and you shouldn't expect to understand what it says. And just by being kind of continuing to do it over and over again, you'll just pick up how to understand what the error is telling you. There is a useful extension in Visual Studio Code called an error lens that displays the error right next to where it's happening. So if you see over here, the text that happens when I hover over the error is displayed in my code like this. And that is done through this error lens extension. And if you go to the left side of your Visual Studio Code, there's this extensions tab that you can click on and search for different types of extensions. There's ones that you might like, Chloe, where you can change the color of your comments using different symbols. There's a lot of cool stuff that you can check out in the extensions tab there. So the second step is to look at the quick fixes. This is for just quick fixes of your code that might arise when you have something more simple like a syntax error. And then, so you first want to check to make sure that your error isn't solvable by just one of these quick fixes. And you can just click on the quick fix button that happens when you hover over the error. There's that button right there, and you just click on it, and it'll suggest a couple quick fixes for you. The next step is to run Flutter clean. This is generally more for when you have errors in your debug console when you're running your app. Just because when you have a Flutter project, it's going to generate a lot of files and folders. And if there's something that goes wrong with that, then it's really hard to pinpoint exactly what happened. So Flutter clean basically just deletes all these auto-generated files and folders, and it basically when it'll create a bunch of errors in your project, but it doesn't actually but don't worry, it's not like something that you can't fix. Basically when you run the app again, it'll regenerate all those files and folders and everything will be resolved, but it just makes sure that there isn't any issues running in the background. And so in some cases that fixes the issue for you. This next step is to ask ChatGPT. And so basically here is a prompt that can help you with using ChatGPT. But basically, hello, I am a insert age year-old learning Flutter. I came across an error and would appreciate your help in how I can solve it, and paste in your error and paste in any relevant code.
You may also want to say how much Flutter you know. Like say I'm a beginner.
Right, yeah. That would also be good to add. And so this can be really useful in asking like follow-up questions. So here is just an example of basically this is the same error example of I didn't import material.dart, so I got all these errors in my code, and then I can kind of have a conversation, and then it can add you can kind of, it's more interactive, and you can ask follow-up questions, such as, oh my gosh, such as, could you explain it again, but more simply to a beginner who just started learning Flutter, and I tried that and it gave me this problem, so it can help you with that. So if you spent more than 10 minutes using ChatGPT, it's probably a good idea to move on to the next step in the debugging process, because there are some issues with ChatGPT, such as it doesn't have recent data, so it can give you outdated solutions, as well as it might misinterpret the problem and suggest things that are incorrect. And so, yeah, the next step is to Google it, which is pretty straightforward, but there are some tips and tricks that you can use to help get the right answers. And so you should copy and paste the error directly into Google or your preferred search engine and add Flutter to the end of it so that it is suggesting things for Flutter or and not some other programming language. And if you're working with something like Firebase or another platform or extension, then you can also add that to kind of get more targeted answers with that search term. And some useful websites that you can look for are Stack Overflow, GitHub, Reddit, and Quora. But generally you can just go through like whichever links are on top. And so generally these websites are structured where there's somebody kind of asking a question, they have an error or problem with their code, and then people will be suggesting solutions to that. And so you want to look at that question that the person has and see if it's similar to the problem that you're having, because if it's not, then generally the answers won't be relevant to you. And so then you can look through the answers, and generally when you're first starting out, you're not really going to understand what it's saying, what people are saying, but as you continue to debug your code and learn more programming things, then you'll start to pick up on the language and understand what people are saying more. But look for kind of like code snippets and instructions and kind of add that code to your app or go through the instructions. And if it doesn't work, then it's fine. You can just undo that and then go to the next answer, but it'll take a lot of kind of trial and error until you finally solve the problem. If you have spent more than 10 minutes trying this as well, then you can move on to the last step, which is to ask an instructor. And so either if you are coding on your own, then you can post it in the FlutterKids room and include your code, your error, what you did before the error occurred, and solutions you've already tried. Or if you're in a Flutter class, then you can just share your screen and kind of explain what error you're running into. But there's a saying that 80% of coding is debugging, and it really is true. So
the rest of the time you're turning your computer on and off.
Yeah. And so debugging is an essential skill in programming, and the only way to get better is by doing it yourself. And even though it's much easier to ask somebody like, oh, could you solve this problem for me? Struggling through it is really the best way to learn programming. But yeah, it isn't the most exciting part, but it helps you get to the exciting part of creating amazing things with code. So